So here Shirov says, well, I need to safeguard my king. Rook e8 first was a very, very important move. The queen on e3 felt very comfortable. Had to be moved away. Queen c3, queen takes, bishop h6. And part of the ideas here, I think that this is actually quite deep. The position obviously favors black. You have 2 pawns, but winning is far from trivial. There are many endgames in which you can go to that because of the opposite colored bishops, they will simply be drawn. Furthermore, positions that are not endgames tend to be very dangerous for black. When the queens are still alive, there are too many dark squared weaknesses for you to make progress. On top of everything, you don't have a counterattack. White's king is way safer than yours. So the problem becomes, how do I actually win this position? Maybe drawing shouldn't be a problem. If I can manage to exchange queens, I can't lose the endgames. But winning? That's not so easy. We're going to see how with very precise play, Shirov actually manages to win this endgame. Rook e5 was first. Now it's very important that tactics work for black in this position. Some traits will not be beneficial for black and some will. For example, if rook e1, bishop takes h3 is an important resource. The queen has to guard the e1 rook. So he cannot take on h3. But because of the pin down the diagonal, also the pawn cannot take on h3. Due to the checkmate threat on g2, you don't have time to take on e5, and this game is winning for black. Also important, if white tries to activate the rook with b1, this simply allows me to play bishop takes h3, and in the case of queen takes h3, the move rook h5 would finish the game. Rook f3 was played in order to avoid this kind of ideas. Then after queen c5, Shirov kept trying to trade queens. He wanted to say, hey, middle games are dangerous, let's go into the end game. I'll take my chances. Maybe you can draw, but I'm sure that 2 pawns are still 2 pawns. Queen a1 was played, bishop f5, rook e3. Now, this is move 40, so a little bit of a threat, right? You cannot take on e3 because queen g7 would be checkmate. Hello. f6 was played, rook e5 and queen e5. And we got into a very complicated endgame. And I just want to point out a little bit about what was happening in the minds of these 2 great players. See, when you and I see this position, okay, mainly you guys, when you see this position, you just kind of assume general concepts. You assume things like, well, I'm up a couple of pawns, or my king's weak, or my king can go here, or my pawn can go here. The difference between these guys and us is that they're not thinking like that. They're calculating. And I cannot stress enough how important it is to calculate, and especially calculate in endgames. The more simple an endgame is, the more likely it is that you can tell which result the game should end in by sheer brute force. For example, all pawn endgames do have 3 possible evaluations. White's winning, black's winning, it's a draw. There is no slightly better, there is no clearly better, there is no decisive advantage. There is winning, lost, or drawn. Why? Because they are so simple that we can calculate it out towards a result. In this kind of positions, the same is true. The difference was that Shirov outcalculated Topalov. After the move played in the game, queen a2 check, and this is very important because if you take on e5, take on e5, I have 3 passed pawns, and you can't stop all of them with a bishop and a king. You just can't. There's too many. You can't actually pass your pawns because opposite color bishops.
So he exchanged?
He did not exchange. He first played queen a2 check, simply moving the queen out of the way. And Shirov came up with a surprising queen d5. So here's what Topalov thought. I'm going to trade, and he did. He should have, by the way, not traded. Conceptually, it's stronger not to trade, but he calculated it out, and he thought, this is a draw. So he takes, and he says, bishop d2, I attack this one. a4, bishop c3, attack this one. Forced king f7. h4, king e6, king g1. And now this was Topalov's idea. If the move king d6 happens, then you have king f2, not take on e5, on f6 by the way, king here, king e3. I control this square. I win this pawn on the next move. And the game should end in a draw. There is no way to pass the pawns. You can't do it. The king is controlling. So at this point, we had kind of a difficult situation. The king cannot really come closer because obviously d5 is taken by the pawn, f5 is taken by the bishop, and e5 is taken by, by this bishop. Now, I don't have the time to play king f5, king e4. So for example, if I play bishop b1, king f2, king f5, just king e3 should be able to draw the game. Yes, you're up 2 pawns, but because of the opposite color bishops, you can't make any progress. The king keeps controlling the d4 and a1 squares, which are really the only thing that you can make progress in. So Shirov came up with what was called at the time the move of the decade, then it was called the move of the century, and now it's considered to be the prettiest move to have ever been played in a real tournament game. At least it's my opinion. He played what looks to be the absolute worst move on the board. Bishop h3. This move looks stupid. I mean, it's the only way you manage to almost lose this endgame. But surprisingly, and what makes this so beautiful, it's also the only winning move.
Wow. Pawns are unstoppable at that point, right?
The idea is simply to gain a tempo. Shirov realized that in all the variations that we've been looking at, the bishop never played any role. Because the bishops are of opposite color, it doesn't help you push the pawns forward. Therefore, the bishop is being used as a kamikaze piece in order to drag white's king behind. Black absolutely needs to control the square e4. If he lands the king on e4, he'll be able to shoulder out the opponent king and take control over the incredibly important d4 square. So, there are many variations here, and we can take a look. But the most obvious one is if you ignore the bishop will insist on sacrificing itself. And then we will reach a position that was basically the same we're going to be looking at, but white's down a pawn. So we're going to take a look at g takes h3, which happened in the game. King f5, king f2, king e4. Now, a major point is that if a3 happens, I've created 3 passed pawns because of the f pawn now being passed, right? a3, king d2, d4, bishop a1. Obviously, the bishop doesn't have any choice but to go to a1. Here and f5. You cannot control every pawn. Also, you have no counterplay because even though you have 2 pawns on the h file, they actually cannot create a passed pawn on their own. Therefore, after bishop takes f6, in order to eliminate this important pawn, d4 was played, locking out the bishop from the a1 square. Now, if king e2, immediately a3 wins. The bishop does not have a route in order to defend a1 on time. Also, since the pawn directs this way, clearly the king is out of the square. Everybody familiar with the square, right? Okay. So bishop e7 was played in order to immediately stop that pawn. And an important move, you cannot allow the king to come into play. King d3, bishop c5, king c4, gaining a tempo on the bishop. The bishop retreats. Obviously, this pawn endgame is completely hopeless because after takes here, king c3, you still cannot get to my pawn. Bishop e7 and king b3. Topalov resigned. The problem was that against pretty much any move that happens in this position, for example, king b3, bishop c5, d3, king e3, or whatever, I get to this configuration sooner or later. The bishop must stop the pawn, and I simply use my remaining passed pawn on a3 as a kamikaze. the a3 will distract the bishop from the pawn at some point. You might as well take it now, and then after d2, I win by queening on the next move.